A 19-year-old Dalian lady named Livia stood chained in the dark in 79 AD beneath the thunderous audience of Rome's finest arena, while 50,000 voices thundered in celebration of the gladiator who had just killed her siblings. Rome's most carefully guarded secret would be what occurred to her over the course of the following 3 hours. Even the chroniclers of the empire questioned whether to document such a cruel practice. Roman senators attempted to obliterate this story from history. When the gates closed behind the champions and the sand became scarlet, the grim recompense that transformed victory into a license for the unimaginable and the reality of what war booty truly meant. If you've ever wondered what actually transpired after the masses left, hit the like button before we reveal what transpired in those underground chambers. What follows will completely alter your perspective on ancient Rome, so be sure to subscribe. Leave a comment below. Was this just the price of empire, or did Roman amusement go too far? What you are going to hear is recorded in Cassius Dio's writings, confirmed by 2018 archaeological digs under the Colosseum, and confirmed by Senate documents found in Vatican archives. These are not myths. The aristocracy of ancient Rome saw these recorded customs as amusement, the arena of blood. In the 1st century AD, the Colosseum served as humanity's monument to spectacle and brutality throughout the Roman Empire. Completed only a year earlier in 80 AD, the enormous stone amphitheater had enough capacity to engulf whole armies. There was always the metallic tang of blood in the air, mingled with the sharp stench of human perspiration and animal feces. The arena floor was covered with sand, not for aesthetic purposes, but to absorb the fluids that poured from dying creatures and men. Rome's most precious resources, as well as the condemned, the imprisoned, and the vanquished, were kept in a maze of tunnels, cages, and chambers beneath the sand. Gladiatorial combat had a function beyond amusement in the midst of imperial victory. They were a combination of social control, religious ritual, and political spectacle in one bloody package. In addition to territory and riches, General Marcus Antonius carried 847 prisoners. 124 of them were women from the tribal aristocracy, back with him when he crushed the Dacian uprising in 78 AD. These were not your average peasants. They were foreign gods' priestesses, warriors' wives, and chieftains' daughters. Rome accomplished more than simply vanquish its adversaries. To crush their spirits so completely that even the memory of resistance would go, it had to humiliate them, the winners and the losers. Gaius, by Roman standards, Valerius Maximus was a giant, standing 6 feet tall at the age of 32. Every scar on his body symbolized a battle won, an opponent eliminated, or a mob appeased. Gaius, who had spent 14 years in the arena, was born into slavery following his father's murder for debt. In authorized combat, he had slain 89 guys. The rudis, the wooden blade that would release him, was what he most desired. His greatest fear was becoming just another nameless corpse pulled out by the hooks. However, on this specific occasion in August of 79 AD, he had recently triumphed over the Dacian captives' champion in front of Emperor Titus. He received the usual award for a gladiator of his caliber: a laurel wreath, 500 denarii in gold, and the female captive's first choice. Livia, who was 19 years old, had the characteristic pale skin and dark hair of the Dacian highlands. She had been engaged to a warrior named Decebalus prior to the Roman armies destroying her community. 3 months prior, she had witnessed Roman soldiers slay him. She now found herself in a holding cell with 17 other women, all of whom had had their lives ripped apart, their families killed, and their futures destroyed. Her only wish was to pass away honorably. She was afraid of being amused by the crowd that had rejoiced over the devastation of her people. She had been informed by a guard that morning that she had been chosen for the afternoon performance. That meant nothing to her. She would soon learn that Rome's idea of mercy was much scarier than its idea of cruelty. The imperial stakes. Individual lives were not the only things in danger. It served as the cornerstone of Roman psychological combat. The empire realized that conquering people physically was insufficient. Destroying their emblems, perverting their revered customs, and proving that even its most defenseless members, their women, were now Rome's toys, were all necessary to genuinely destroy a nation. This cruelty wasn't arbitrary. Dehumanization was deliberate. Every conquered nation was encouraged by the sight of helplessness. The defeat was complete and the resistance was futile. They had no idea that the events of this day would later become so well known that the Senate would have to step in. The winner's selection. The master of games entered the hippogum, the subterranean complex under the arena, at exactly 3 o'clock as the shadows stretched across the blood-soaked sand. He brought a bronze tablet with the potential rewards to Gaius Valerius Maximus in the torchlit hallway that smelled of damp stone and terror. The gladiator's head was muddled by the closeness to death he had just avoided. His muscles were burning, and his hands were still shaking from combat adrenaline. As the official said, "The emperor acknowledges your success. You are entitled to the spoils of conquest by imperial decree and long-standing custom. Choose your prize." Had they realized that this ordinary transaction, which had been made hundreds of times before, would start a series of events that would eventually reach the Senate floor in less than a month? Money, wine, a night in a decent bed, or what they dubbed Victoria Carnalis, the carnal luxury of victory, were among the alternatives listed on the tablet. This was one of the few times of power in an otherwise helpless life for a slave who had nothing and may be slain at any time. Roman culture accepted this as the norm and even applauded it. For the conqueror's enjoyment, the conquered existed. That was the preparation, the logic of the empire honed over decades. A different sort of preparation was taking place in the holding cell for the women. Buckets of water, not for drinking but for washing, were brought in by the guards. The women were cleaned, their hair combed out, and their ripped garments swapped out for plain tunics. Livia observed as 2 attendants methodically went through the group, inspecting each woman and recording their observations on wax tablets. The reality they all feared was spoken by an older lady, Zalmoxis, a priestess who had worked at the Demian Temple of the Sun. "They're making us presentable for the games or for after." The preparations were finished, but something else was in the works, something that would transform ordinary exploitation into a millennium-long scandal. 50,000 people were settling in for the afternoon secondary entertainment in the amphitheater above. The arena masters arranged hunts, what Roman historians tactfully referred to as mythological reenactments, simulated wars, and what they called theatrical interludes in between big gladiatorial fights. In the guise of divine entertainment, they frequently featured condemned prisoners compelled to perform mythological events that typically resulted in actual death. The triumph of Rome against barbarian humiliation, however, was a unique aspect of today's program. Awaiting you is the arena. At 2:30, 20 Dian ladies were escorted up through the subterranean elevator system, an engineering wonder that uses trapdoors to bring combatants, animals, and props straight onto the arena surface. Livia stepped out into the glaring sun and the loud din. The shout of the crowd was like a physical blow. Underneath it all, she could smell the copper stench of dried blood on hot sand, along with the scent of perfume from the aristocratic quarters and roasting meat from the merchants. What ought to have been a swift, vicious execution turned into something much more planned. A herald revealed the misdeeds of the women as they were lined up, refusing to accept Roman gods, hiding rebels, and opposing Roman rule. The twist then appeared. Pairs of them, armed with wooden swords and dressed in ripped garments designed to inflict the greatest amount of humiliation, would engage in combat in an attempt to gain pity. Rome's champions would claim the winners. The losers would perish. Click like if you're shocked to learn about this degree of premeditated brutality. How this amusement turned into policy is explained in the next section, the tipping point. They handed out the wooden swords. Gripping hers, Livia felt the coarse grain against her rough palm. On the other side of her was Kamasikis, Debilus's sister, who had sung at Livia's betrothal ceremony and had taught her how to weave. They looked at each other. Blood was screamed by the crowd. The afternoon sun pounded down with ruthlessness. The game master held up his hand and then let it down. The two women did not move. The scream of the crowd changed from enthusiasm to perplexity to rage. They screamed, "Fight! Cowards who are barbarians!" It started to rain missiles, refuse from the concession areas, chicken bones, and olive pits. With wooden swords by their sides, the women remained still. For the helpless, it was the strongest act of resistance they could muster: refusal. Two women without weapons stood motionless for 90 seconds, defying the mightiest empire on the planet. The guards then entered. What ought to have been theatrical turned into a harsh reality. A gladiator's flat was used to strike Kamasikas from behind. She went down. The audience applauded. With a scream, Livia dropped her wooden blade and ran to her side. Instead of taking them to be executed, the guards dragged them both to something that the audience found just as amusing. The administrative apparatus of exploitation, which advanced with bureaucratic efficiency, was the real tragedy exposed in the Hippodrome. 20 female captives of Dean ancestry were documented by a scribe in official ledgers and processed for post-victory allotment. As is customary, another notation that was too difficult to use was moved to private rooms for the exclusive use of champions. The complete commodification of humans that ensued would be recalled as Rome's most effective dehumanization scheme. Kamasikis and Livy parted ways. They were all led to separate chambers, tiny spaces with iron rings fastened into the walls, stone benches, and doors that shut from the outside. The rooms were immaculate, well lit, and, in their banal efficiency, completely unnerving. This was no gloomy, makeshift horror dungeon. These were specially designed areas that were included into the architecture of the arena, much like the gladiator elevators or the lion tunnels. At 4, Gas Valerius Maximus came into Livia's room. Silence descended as the door opened and eyes locked. His chest was covered in blood that wasn't his own, and he was still wearing his arena armor. She was tired, without a weapon, and pressed up against the distant wall. The chasm of Roman law still between them. He was legally entitled to do anything he wanted. She had absolutely no rights. She was property, loot, a blood-stained reward. The gas felt at that time is not described in historical records. Was there a human there? Did he spot a prize for winning? Was the system that made him a victim and a perpetrator something he questioned? We only know what transpired next, which was documented by a clerk handling standard paperwork rather than by Gas or Livia. Then the act of defiance, the unimaginable, took place. Gas took off his helmet, put his sword down, and sat with his head and his hands on the stone seat. He remained silent for 5 minutes, which is an eternity in heartbeats. Every muscle in Livia's body strained for violence that never materialized. After learning from other inmates, he finally talked in fractured dialect. What was his name? Whose name? They forced you to watch the man die. The warrior I murdered today? Dialis? A different one, no. 3 months prior. Gas gave a slow nod. Today I killed a Diabolus. Perhaps a cousin, perhaps a brother. That name is very popular among your people. What transpired was a dialogue between two individuals the empire had attempted to dehumanize, rather than the attack Rome's system had anticipated. Gas told her about his father, who was put to death when he was 9 years old. Livia told him about the burning of her community. It was 2 hours later. After checking twice and hearing conversation, the guards assumed cooperation and left them alone. Gas made a choice that would cost him everything at 6 o'clock. He got up, went to the door, and summoned the guard. "This lady is ill," he declared, "contaminated. I turn her down. Bring her to the doctor." It was the system's sole weakness. Refusing to accept diseased incentives could result in the return to regular prisoner status. It was an obvious falsehood. The guard was aware of it. However, there were regulations in place, because it was easier from a bureaucratic standpoint to deny a gladiator's claim than to go into his motivations. Livia was taken to the holding room for medical personnel. Despite the immediate consequences, she passed away 3 days later from an infection, a typical cause of death in Roman captivity rather than from assault. The medical holding area was filthy, crowded, and uncaring. She was sent to another nightmare by the same mercy that had saved her from the first. She was never seen by Gas again. That month, he battled twice more, won both times, and turned down incentives both times. The empire waited. Throughout the gladiatorial barracks, rumors circulated. Maximus had been plagued by Dicarian witchcraft, had softened, and had become a follower of one of those weird Eastern faiths that advocated pity. Actually, he had just recalled that he was a human. Then the storm hit. The reckoning of Rome. Senator Quintus Aurelius Semachus presented a formal complaint to the Senate on September 15, 79 AD. His trainer had beaten his nephew, a young gladiator, for declining the customary post-victory prizes. The nephew asserted that Maximus's example had motivated him. According to the trainer, he was upholding appropriate Roman principles. Apart from forcing the Senate to officially admit what everyone knew existed, the lawsuit was inconsequential. Senate documents recount that a contentious discussion arose over the appropriateness of specific procedures concerning female prisoners who were defeated. A vicious 4-hour debate about whether Rome's treatment of conquered women had moved beyond permissible brutality to something that even seasoned senators found excessive was hidden behind that bland wording. Tradition was argued by the conservative group, which was led by Senator Fabius. Our forefathers completely subdued their adversaries, body and soul. Rome became great as a result. "We make martyrs and fuel opposition," retorted the reform side, which was influenced by Stoic philosophy and practical worries about provincial uprisings. Dead rebels are traumatized and unable to produce new rebels. Survivors bring back tales that incite hatred for generations. Not morality was the deciding element, politics was involved. Increased insurrection activity had been recorded by 3 different provincial governors, who notably pointed to the Roman treatment of captured women as a recruiting tool for anti-Roman resistance. The empire itself was suffering. The Senate officially responded on October 1, 79 AD, passing what historians refer to as the Statute of Captive Women, or Lex Captivi. Although its provisions were limited, they were revolutionary. It was no longer possible to utilize female POWs as prizes in public performances. Private exploitation persisted. The public drama of humiliation finished, but no one was set free by the law. There was inconsistent enforcement. A lot of arena managers disregarded it. However, the idea was proven. Rome, at least in public, had its bounds. 3 months later, Gas Valerius Maximus was freed, not out of pity, but because he had won 5 more straight bouts. Buying and releasing one Dian woman from slavery was his last known act as a free man. Her name is merely listed as Commiciscus in historical sources. Although not proved, there is a strong suspicion that she was the same woman who stood next to Livia in the arena. The unstated expense. Imagine Gas realizing that his one act of kindness saved one woman for days, but that it had no effect on the hundreds or thousands that came before or after. The system was too extensive, too well established, and too lucrative to disrupt. He made the motion of drops in a sea of blood. Imagine Livia dying in a cramped cell from an avoidable infection in her last hours, knowing that she had been spared one tragedy only to be killed by another, knowing that her death was too ordinary to be documented in Rome's calculus. The tragedy is not that Rome was harsh, even though the gladiators' extraordinary mercy was relegated to a footnote in Senate deliberations. Ancient warfare was characterized by cruelty. Tragically, centuries later, Rome bureaucratized and systematized it, transforming human agony into effective entertainment through supply chains and paperwork. Under the direction of Dr. Isabella Fortunato, archaeologists from the University of Rome dug up the hypogem beneath the eastern part of the Colosseum in 2018. They found something that isn't depicted on tourist maps: a system of tiny chambers with walls encircled by iron rings. Drainage channels leave scratches on stone and cut into floors. Desperate fingers searching for a grip, a way out, or any evidence that they had ever been there. Architectural studies and carbon dating verified that these chambers were purpose-built and part of the 80-80 structure, not expansions. Fragments of earthenware that were used to transport food and water were discovered, indicating extended occupancy. Most revealing, they discovered 6 bronze identity badges bearing dates from 792 AD and the word captiva stamped on them. These results were contrasted with textual evidence by Dr. Fortunato's team. 3rd century historical records by Casso specifically mentioned Romes where conquered ladies were given to fighters who won battles. The practice was mentioned in passing in Seneca's letters from decades ago. Scholars believe that even Tacitus, who typically describes Roman atrocities in vivid detail, found it too upsetting to document in detail because he was strangely mute on specifics. Conflicting theories surfaced. According to some historians, the custom was uncommon and only occurred around particular holidays. Others contend it was systematic and routine, pointing to the specialist architecture and numerous historical allusions. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, neither often nor uncommon, but frequent enough to call for specialized facilities. Heritage of culture. The tale has been told for ages. Theodore Mommsen, a 19th century historian, referred to it as Rome's most effective dehumanization. It was subtly alluded to in the 2000 movie Gladiator. Whether describing it inevitably tackles historical fact or sensationalizes Roman cruelty is a topic of disagreement among contemporary scholars. Why is it still important? Because it demonstrates how societies utilize custom, law, and entertainment to excuse brutality. Rome wasn't particularly cruel, but it was very good at institutionalizing evil, normalizing violence, and transforming cries into cheers. The lesson that applies to everyone. This catastrophe shows us that how we treat the weak is what separates civilization from barbarism, not architecture or technology. Rome constructed rape chambers beneath entertainment venues and constructed aqueducts that are still in use. Moral bankruptcy and engineering brilliance coexisted together. It demonstrates how human nature is distorted by power relations on both sides. In addition to being a victim, Gas was also enslaved, coerced into killing, and given authority over an even weaker person. The system turned people who may have been neighbors into monsters, and turned agony that ought to have inspired compassion into entertainment. It illustrates the peril of using tradition as an excuse. Rome became the answer to all moral questions because of what our forebears did. Atrocities become commonplace when conscience is replaced by custom. The unanswered questions. What more mysteries are concealed behind the monuments we honor? How many tourist destinations are constructed on top of layers of pain that have been buried? At what point does historical atrocity need to be acknowledged? And at what point does it turn into exploitation? Imagine Livia's final thoughts as she passes away from an infection in a cell beneath the most impressive architectural feat of her time. Did she question whether anyone would recall? Did she think her name would be spoken and her identification tag discovered by archaeologists 2,000 years later? The darkest periods of history tell us that civilization is brittle, that development isn't inevitable, and that each generation must decide between expediency and empathy. Rome went with spectacle. The lesson endures in the ruins beneath the sand, but the cost was measured in lives lost. The legacy lives on. Thus, the triumph of a gladiator turned into an excuse for dehumanization. Rome's most meticulously concealed scandal turned out to be a typical reward scheme. In imperial ledgers, 847 Dacian captives were reduced to footnotes. Only because a gladiator made a peculiar decision that accomplished nothing more than demonstrating that humanity could shine even in the most sinister nooks of Rome did one woman's name, Livia, endure. If you were shaken by this story, you should subscribe, because hard realities from history are more important than cozy myths. Press the bell to begin our next exploration of the Colosseum's secret rooms, where we'll learn what became of the 5,000 animals killed during the arena's first games and why archaeologists discovered human bones among them. What worried you the most? Let us know in the comments. The exploitation's methodical character or Rome's skill in normalizing it. The Vestal virgins who were buried alive for violating their vows will be the subject of our next investigation. Nevertheless, it is possible that one of them was set up by an emperor seeking political retribution. Everything historians believe to be true is altered by the evidence that was only recently found in 2023. Until then, keep in mind that the grandest monuments of civilization frequently conceal the darkest truths of history. Not all of the blood on the sand was from combat. Sometimes it came from power that was unbridled, from innocence that was transformed into a spectacle, or from the instant that evil was praised and humanity turned its back.